Most people think they know what Niccolò Machiavelli thought about women. This often includes a quote from The Prince, delivered with an air of finality, as if it settles the issue. Machiavelli writes that fortune is a woman, and to maintain control over her, one must beat and strike her. This line has persisted through the years, often seen as incriminating, violent, and a convenient condemnation. The first time I encountered this quote in a contemporary article on gender politics, it was presented as irrefutable proof of Machiavelli's contempt for women. There was no room for doubt, no consideration of context, just a straightforward moral judgment. Yet, when I examined the entire chapter, I found that the passage did not align with the initial interpretation. Machiavelli wasn't discussing marriage or women's nature. Instead, he was analyzing the unpredictable nature of political life, referring to fortuna as chance, instability, and the destructive flood that overwhelms even the most carefully built defenses. In Renaissance Florence, this wasn't just an abstract idea. The Arno River frequently flooded, causing real damage. Regimes collapsed rapidly. The Medici family fell from power in 1494. Republics rose and fell. Power in Florence wasn't a stable inheritance, but a constantly shifting experiment. Machiavelli's words about fortune were directed at rulers who risked losing everything in a short period. Present-day readers view this line with a different perspective. After decades of corporate gender studies and movements focused on gender representation in leadership positions, the metaphor feels like a personal attack. A 2012 study from the University of Waterloo revealed that when people read gendered metaphors related to dominance, they tended to attribute hostility to the speaker rather than viewing it as a figure of speech. The brain conflates metaphor with personal opinion, assuming that symbolic language exposes personal hatred. Machiavelli wrote inside a symbolic framework where femininity was linked to instability and nature. This raises an uncomfortable question. Is he expressing misogyny, or is he using an existing cultural symbol to emphasize his warning? In Discourses on Levi, Machiavelli praises Roman virtue, firmness, decisiveness, and the skill to impose order on chaotic situations. Here, his language is less sexualized and more focused on civic duty. He criticizes leaders who are indecisive and hesitate when quick action is needed. He doesn't start discussing women as citizens or moral figures. They are mostly absent. This absence is informative, but not in an obvious way. I expected to find clear examples of hostility toward women. Instead, I found something more calculated: strategic language. When Machiavelli describes fortune in feminine terms, he isn't analyzing women. He's portraying uncertainty as something that must be controlled. It's a move of psychological positioning. If unpredictability is seen as feminine, then aggression is justified as necessary firmness. The metaphor works, preparing the reader emotionally for harsh measures. This isn't unique to Machiavelli. In 1973, psychologist Albert Bandura showed how moral disengagement works through euphemisms. When aggression is framed as a duty, people experience less stress. Calling it necessary action has a calming effect. Machiavelli does something similar rhetorically, calling for striking fortune not as an act of cruelty, but as an element of strategic realism. Violence becomes a technique. This is where projection begins. We interpret the line as a personal statement about women. But what if the real issue is male anxiety? Studies at Harvard Business School in the early 2000s found that male executives facing market instability showed stronger tendencies toward risk-taking and forceful decision-making. Uncertainty threatened their sense of self, and decisive action restored it. The metaphor of conquering fortune may be less about women and more about reinforcing the ruler's self-image. This shift surprised me. The outrage narrative is neat and satisfies a moral need. However, a deeper reading reveals a more nuanced picture. If woman in this context represents chaos, then the insult is secondary. The main conflict is between control and unpredictability. Still, this doesn't excuse Machiavelli. The choice of metaphor matters. Language shapes how we see the world. A 2011 study from Stanford showed that describing crime as a beast versus a virus led people to support very different policy responses. Metaphors guide strategy. If fortune is a woman to be beaten, the ruler is primed for domination rather than adaptation. What troubles me isn't whether Machiavelli liked or disliked women. There's little evidence he developed a consistent theory about them. What troubles me is how effectively the metaphor stirs emotion. It gives the reader an easy target. Chaos becomes gendered, and fear becomes justified aggression. Centuries later, we do something similar. We take his metaphor and use it as proof of personal misogyny, turning a political strategy into a character judgment. This feels justified, but may simplify a deeper issue, that power systems need an enemy image, which often borrows from readily available cultural symbols. Was Machiavelli describing women, or was he describing how power relates to uncertainty? If we misinterpret the metaphor, we may miss the underlying mechanism. If we miss the mechanism, we might fail to notice when the same structure reappears with different words and targets, but the same logic of control remains hidden underneath. If the metaphor isn't really about women, we must ask a more unsettling question. What psychological work is it performing? When Machiavelli writes in The Prince that fortune favors the bold and must be struck down and dominated, the obvious message is brutality. However, beneath the surface is a specific emotional instruction. He's telling the ruler how to feel when events become uncontrollable. Renaissance Italy was not a stable political landscape. Alliances shifted quickly, and armies changed sides for money. In 1498, when Machiavelli entered public service in Florence, the Republic was balancing French influence and internal conflicts. Nothing was certain. Fortuna wasn't just a poetic device. It was a lived reality of instability. The metaphor becomes tighter here. In that time, femininity symbolized changeability, seduction, and emotional ups and downs. Calling fortune a woman encoded unpredictability in a familiar image. But psychologically, what Machiavelli personifies is chaos itself, which is intolerable to anyone whose sense of self depends on control. In 1975, psychologist Ellen Langer did experiments on the illusion of control. Participants who picked their own lottery tickets demanded more money to sell them than those given tickets randomly. Nothing objective changed, but the feeling of control boosted their confidence. Losing that feeling raises anxiety. Leaders aren't immune to this effect. They're often more prone to it because their status depends on appearing decisive. In times of instability, aggression can appear as decisiveness. A 2007 study by Kathleen Vose and colleagues in Science showed that when people experience randomness, they try to find patterns and assert stronger beliefs, even without support. The mind compensates for disarray by building certainty. In political leadership, this can take the form of forceful action. Machiavelli seems to understand this centuries in advance. He doesn't suggest patience with fortune. He advises striking her. Hesitation weakens authority, and a ruler who waits for stability appears vulnerable. Here, a darker aspect appears. When unpredictability is coded as feminine, control is gendered as masculine. The psychological impact is subtle yet strong. Masculine. If chaos is she, domination becomes not just a strategy, but a way to restore order. Aggression is recast as necessary virility. I saw an echo of this in leadership studies after the 2008 financial crisis. Researchers at the University of Cambridge studied corporate decision-making during the market upheaval. Male executives facing high uncertainty tended to increase risk rather than decrease it, describing bold moves as taking back control. Female executives in the same data were more likely to diversify and hedge. This reflected not competence, but identity under pressure. We like to think aggression is a rational calculation, but cortisol studies suggest otherwise. Under unpredictable stress, some men's testosterone levels rise, reinforcing dominant actions. The body leans towards confrontation. This physiological change is often overlooked in political theory. Machiavelli's advice aligns with it. Act decisively, impose your will, and overwhelm uncertainty before it overwhelms you. I didn't expect the language to seem so erotic when read closely. Fortune favors the bold. She allows herself to be mastered by the audacious. The metaphor includes seduction. Control isn't only strategic, it's intimate. The ruler doesn't just manage chaos, he conquers it. This eroticization of control also appears in modern power dynamics. A 2013 study from the University of British Columbia found that people primed with power-related cues showed higher sexual confidence and less empathy in controlled settings. Power and desire share neural pathways linked to reward. When leaders talk about dominating markets or crushing opposition, the language reflects conquest narratives. For those under them, this feels different. I've talked to mid-level managers in multinational companies during restructuring. When leaders adopt a bold, aggressive approach, employees feel both fear and admiration. Aggressive approach. An executive at a tech firm during the 2020 downturn described his plan as going on offense against uncertainty, which led to layoffs. The workforce felt trauma, while leadership framed it as strength. Machiavelli understands this split. The prince must appear fearless, but the population pays the price. Aggression reassures observers that someone is in control, whether or not that control is real. Why equate unpredictability with femininity? Because cultural metaphors are tools that compress complexity into emotional images. If chaos is a storm, we build walls. If chaos is a woman, we dominate. The second image mobilizes defense and reinforces identity. Yet the mechanism reveals something fragile. If control must be dramatized so strongly, it may be because it's never secure. The metaphor reassures the ruler as much as it instructs him, suggesting that volatility can be subdued with enough boldness. But what if fortune can't be subdued? What if aggression makes instability worse? History contains examples where overconfidence led to collapse. Leaders who increased risk during crises sometimes brought down entire systems. Machiavelli's advice sounds confident, but reads psychologically like a defense against panic. If fortune is chaos and chaos is feminized, then domination becomes a ritual to soothe those in power. The question that troubles me isn't whether Machiavelli misunderstood women, but whether he understood men too well. If this mapping of anxiety onto a symbolic, she continues today, what other metaphors are shaping how power reacts when things become unstable? If he understood male anxiety so precisely, his silence on women becomes more interesting than his metaphors. Reading The Prince carefully, then moving through discourses on Livy, you notice an almost surgical quality. Armies are analyzed, conspiracies are dissected, and republics are praised, corrupted, and rebuilt. And generals, popes, and mercenaries are mentioned constantly, but women are almost never discussed as political or strategic figures, except symbolically through fortune. At first, this seems simple. Renaissance politics was male-dominated, so Machiavelli wrote about men. That's a comfortable explanation, but it's not complete. Florence, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, had a complex network of marriage alliances. The Medici family secured influence through banking, militia, and carefully arranged marriages. In 1469, Clarice Orsini married Lorenzo de' Medici, strengthening ties with Roman nobility. This wasn't sentimental, it was geopolitical strategy. Yet when Machiavelli discusses power, these relationships fade. He writes about principalities, virtue, and the mechanics of fear. He doesn't map the negotiations in salons, private chambers, and correspondence. This omission seems less accidental when you consider figures like Isabella d'Este, who in the late 15th century negotiated alliances between Mantua, Milan, and Ferrara through letters. Her correspondence shows her arranging military aid, cultural patronage, and the release of political prisoners. She didn't command armies, but she influenced those who did. Or Caterina Sforza, who in 1488 defended her fortress after her husband's assassination. Accounts describe her standing on the battlements, defiant despite her children being held hostage, showing visible power that challenges the idea of female marginality. Machiavelli knew these figures, traveling on diplomatic missions and observing court politics. Yet his framework defines power as something exercised through force, deception, and institutional authority. Influence through kinship, reputation, seduction, or emotional leverage rarely receives systematic treatment. I began to suspect that this absence was methodological. Modern organizational psychology offers a comparison. Research in 2009 in Administrative Science Quarterly showed that informal networks inside companies often have more influence on decisions than formal hierarchies. Employees who control information flow, assistants, coordinators, social connectors, shape strategy without holding official titles, but corporate manuals focus on structure charts, not informal interactions. Power prefers what can be diagrammed. Machiavelli builds a geometry of control. His prince commands troops, punishes enemies, and manipulates appearances. Informal influence is harder to quantify, relying on intimacy, persuasion, and emotional intelligence, which resist being codified into clear rules of domination. Here, the psychological conflict sharpens: exclusion versus influence. By excluding women from his model, Machiavelli may not be dismissing their agency. He may be discarding what can't be weaponized in the same way as armies and fear. He values visible coercion over relational manipulation, even though both operate simultaneously. I didn't expect this to feel familiar. In modern boardrooms, I've seen senior executives ignore the quiet influence of long-term advisors because it doesn't appear in performance metrics. Then, a crisis hits, and the informal network decides who survives restructuring. The official narrative speaks of decisive leadership, but employees experience something else: whispered alliances, private assurances, and reputations built over years. Similar dynamics played out in Renaissance courts. Marriage negotiations could avert wars, and a rumor from a noblewoman could shift loyalty. Yet Machiavelli's system trains the ruler to watch generals and conspirators, not social circles. There's a strategic advantage in this narrowing. By defining politics as a stage for male-coded actions, war, punishment, audacity, he simplifies the battlefield, creating a world where power is wielded with clarity and boldness. The messy, emotionally charged world of relationships remains peripheral. This shapes perception. If something isn't theorized, it becomes invisible in analysis, and what is invisible is harder to counter. Psychologists studying attentional blindness have proven this. In the 1999 experiment by Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons, participants counting basketball passes often missed a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. Attention creates reality. What the mind is trained to see becomes the only relevant field. Machiavelli trains rulers to see open threats and strategic opportunities, not the slow buildup of influence in domestic and social spheres. Whether that was a blind spot or a choice is unclear, but the effect is the same. A political world where women appear marginal because the definition of politics excludes their methods. For people living in such a system, the consequences are subtle. If your influence is relational rather than institutional, it's powerful, yet deniable. You can shape outcomes while remaining officially insignificant, creating a strange psychological position, agency, without recognition. Did Machiavelli ignore women, or did he exclude what he couldn't easily integrate into a system of control? If power is defined only as what is visible and coercive, then entire channels of influence vanish from theory but not from reality. When those channels operate outside the official map, they become harder to predict, regulate, and dominate. This raises a disturbing question. Was the omission an oversight, or was it a strategic simplification designed to keep the prince focused on a narrower, more controllable model of power, even if that model was incomplete? If the omission was strategic, the private material becomes dangerous because, in private, the map changes. Reading Machiavelli's letters, especially those after his exile in 1512, reveals a shift in tone. After his exile, the architect of statecraft becomes ironic, self-mocking, and even needy. In a letter to Francesco Vittori, he talks about wearing courtly clothes to converse with ancient thinkers in the evening, then returning to taverns and crude jokes. This voice is playful, sometimes vulgar, not what you would expect from someone who sees the world in neat, militarized hierarchies. This tonal contrast matters. Publicly, in The Prince, power is disciplined, calculated, and emotion is secondary. Privately, desire seeps through. The most revealing shift appears in La Mandragola, written around 1518, where the political theorist stages a sexual conspiracy. A young man, Callimaco, wants Lucrezia, a married woman known for her virtue. He doesn't storm a fortress, but constructs a narrative. A fake medical scheme with a mandrake potion is invented. A corrupt friar legitimizes the lie, and the husband is manipulated through fear of infertility. Everyone participates in deception. What unsettled me is that Lucrezia isn't portrayed as a passive victim. By the play's end, she understands the manipulation and chooses to continue the affair, adapting and recalculating her moral position. The power game is mutual. This differs from the abstract metaphor of Fortuna. Here, influence flows through seduction, persuasion, and emotional leverage, the channels excluded from formal doctrine. Women are intelligent strategists, while men are foolish, vain, and easily flattered. The hierarchy dissolves into opportunism. Psychologically, satire allows truths that formal doctrine cannot. In 1984, psychologist Robert Trivers expanded on self-deception theory, arguing that people deceive others more effectively when they partially believe their own narratives. In La Mandragola, each character creates justifications. The friar frames adultery as divine will. The husband convinces himself the risk is worth it, and Lucrezia reframes betrayal as destiny. No one feels like a villain. Betrayal. This isn't misogyny, but universal manipulation. I didn't expect the symmetry. If Machiavelli despised women as weak or irrational, why give Lucrezia strategic intelligence? Why show her reading the situation and exploiting it? The play suggests something more corrosive. Everyone is maneuvering within constraints, and morality bends under incentive. Modern behavioral economics offers a comparison. A 2001 study by Dan Ariely showed that when people can cheat for advantage while rationalizing it, most cheat a little, preserving their self-image while gaining something. In La Mandragola, everyone adjusts and slides morally. The contrast with the austere tone of the prince challenges the moral ground. In the treatise, the ruler must learn not to be good when necessary, but in the comedy, no one is good to begin with. They're flexible. This flexibility includes gender. Erotic manipulation becomes a shared language. Lucrezia's decision isn't framed as seduction imposed on her, but as a strategic acceptance of a new reality. Power flows through desire. In contemporary corporate scandals, recurring patterns emerge. Internal investigations within multinational corporations often reveal private communications filled with humor and irony that stand in stark contrast to the official ethical pronouncements of the organizations. While public policies emphasize integrity, private exchanges expose negotiation tactics, subtle flirtations, and calculated strategies. This disparity is not coincidental, it is systemic. Organizations diligently cultivate a moral image for public consumption, while, behind the scenes, they navigate a complex web of incentives. Niccolò Machiavelli seemingly accepted this dichotomy. His public writings served as training for rulers, while his private communications exposed the practical realities of human behavior when personal desires came into play. A further dimension exists: personal desires. In his personal correspondence, Machiavelli frequently lamented his financial insecurity and his dependence on patrons. His writings did not originate from a position of sustained power, but rather from a state of exclusion, fueled by a desire to regain favor. His analysis of manipulation was not theoretical. It was born from personal experience. He intimately understood the feeling of needing to exert influence without holding any formal authority. This understanding complicates accusations of simple disdain toward women. His satire was, arguably, directed at everyone: priests, husbands, lovers, and institutions alike. Gender appeared secondary to the ability to adapt and maneuver. However, the theory showed weaknesses. If the female characters in La Mandragola were capable strategists, one cannot simply assume earlier writings reflect a belief in female incompetence. Instead, it suggests a deliberate choice as to what constitutes politics. This choice bears psychological consequences. By distinguishing between formal statecraft and the more subtle maneuvers of erotic and relational life, Machiavelli created two distinct arenas, one of official power and another of intimate influence. These arenas, while intertwined in practice, remained theoretically separate. For average individuals, this division is palpable. In the workplace, official hierarchies exist alongside informal alliances formed through attraction, trust, and resentment. Promotions are justified based on metrics, yet decisions are swayed by relationships. Employees recognize this inherent contradiction. sensing that outcomes are not solely based on procedure, even though the official narrative tends to ignore the emotional factors at play. La Mandragola, in its approach, does not ignore these factors. Instead, it celebrated them. Was Machiavelli, then, a cynic when it came to women, or was he instead providing insight into a species proficient at using both force and seduction, fear and desire to exercise authority? If his public doctrine focused on coercion while his private art exposed the mutual manipulation, then the tension was not centered on gender. It instead highlighted the inherent instability that exists between the image of control and the realities of human appetite. Considering these coexisting layers in his work raises a key question. Which Machiavelli should we believe? The one who systematizes domination, or the one who laughs at everyone's self-deception? Or is the laughter itself merely another strategy of influence? If the humor found in his comedies exposes a universal propensity for manipulation, then the vocabulary in his political writings reveals something even sharper: the societal construction of weakness. Repeatedly, when criticizing leaders in Discourses on Livy and The Prince, Niccolò Machiavelli employed terms that translate to effeminate, soft, and corrupted by luxury. His criticism appeared mainly directed at male leaders who hesitated, avoided conflict, and chose comfort over discipline. In this context, effeminacy was not a remark about women, but rather an accusation that power has diminished its strength. This reveals where the metaphor transforms into a weapon. Renaissance Italy associated masculinity with martial virtues. A city reliant on mercenaries rather than its own citizens was seen as weakened, made soft by its wealth. Debates in early 16th century Florence regarding militia reform often framed the reliance on hired troops as moral decay. Machiavelli championed citizen armies precisely because he believed dependence produced softness, a quality that, in his vocabulary, was feminized. The underlying psychological mechanism becomes clear here. To maintain authority, power must define itself by what it is not. To maintain it must establish a symbolic opposite. Vulnerability, in this case, was coded as feminine, not because women are inherently weak, but because the metaphor served as a more accessible tool, compressing contempt, fear, and urgency into a single construct. Contemporary studies validate how well this kind of coding works. A study appearing in Psychological Science in 2010 showed that when leadership qualities were described using stereotypical masculine terms such as assertive, decisive, and dominant, participants rated male candidates as more competent. Identical behaviors described using neutral or communal language resulted in a drop in perceived authority. The behavior was the same, but the framing changed the result. Machiavelli instinctively understood the effect of framing. Rather than merely tell a prince do not hesitate to dissuade him from indecision, he connects hesitation to effeminacy. The latter does more than instruct. It shames, activating a threat to one's identity. And identity threat changes behavior. Psychologist Claude Steele's 1997 work on stereotype threat showed that when individuals felt their identity was imperiled, their performance shifted noticeably. In leadership environments, being labeled as weak or soft can trigger reactive aggression. I've witnessed this pattern in corporate restructuring sessions. A senior executive, even subtly accused of lacking toughness, will often overcompensate by enacting drastic changes. Layoffs become a means to show resolve, and cost-cutting turns into a dramatic performance. Those working under such leaders perceive this as a sudden hardness. The communication shifts, with phrases like, "We must be ruthless and we cannot afford sentiment," becoming prevalent. Subordinates sense the change in climate while the leader feels vindicated. In Machiavelli's rhetoric, femininity becomes a stand-in for all the qualities a ruler must avoid: passivity, dependency, and emotional excess. This is not a sociological observation, but a strategy using the contrast to masculinize control by feminizing weakness. The issue has a more somber side. Gender transforms into a political tool. Early modern texts, beyond Machiavelli, followed similar patterns. In 17th century English political pamphlets, opponents were ridiculed as womanish to suggest cowardice. It was an effective insult, connecting political failure to a violation of masculine norms. No detailed argument was necessary. A single adjective could undermine credibility. My primary interest is not the insult itself, but how exactly it works. Societies project vulnerability onto an area that can safely contain it. In Machiavelli's Florence, femininity fulfilled this role. By externalizing vulnerability in this way, the ruling identity remained decisive, controlled, and unyielding. This projection has impacts on ordinary people. A study published in the Journal of Applied Psychology in 2015 found that male managers who feared appearing weak were less likely to seek feedback from their subordinates. This was especially prevalent in competitive organizations that equated decisiveness with strength, resulting in significant strategic blind spots. While teams suffered, the manager's image was intact. Theory begins to break down here. If labeling something feminine is a way to isolate weakness, then the metaphor is not truly about women. It focuses on guarding the myth of unassailable authority. The cost is palpable. The vocabulary of power may ostracize vulnerability, but it does not disappear. Instead, it results in suppressed doubt, impulsive decisions, and overcorrection. Those working under such leadership experience resulting oscillations, sudden aggression followed by subsequent instability. From my observations within hierarchical organizations, leaders who most vehemently reject softness often exhibit the most anxiety in private. The charade of hardness proves exhausting, yet the system rewards it. Machiavelli does not mask this behavior. He advises appearing merciful while being prepared to act cruelly, controlling one's image with precision. Masculinity, in this respect, is a performance calibrated to discourage challenges, rather than an inherent characteristic. The topic is no longer women, but how power constructs itself through establishing contrast. It draws a boundary around acceptable emotion, and anything that might threaten decisiveness is symbolically expelled. This leads to a disturbing question. If masculinity within political language acts as a mechanism built to suppress visible vulnerability, what happens when unpredictability cannot be suppressed by these means? Where does the unwanted fragility go when external threats are eliminated? If power depends on continually projecting weakness outward, must it eventually require new symbolic targets to sustain its image of strength? If so, then the metaphor of woman is no longer incidental. It becomes structural. In The Prince, when Niccolò Machiavelli describes Fortuna as an entity to be mastered, struck, and controlled, he is articulating a pattern far older than Renaissance Florence. Chaos is personified, given a face that is often feminine, allowing authority to define itself through conquest of that image. Archetypal psychology noted this much later. Carl Jung wrote about the anima, the internal feminine image, within the male psyche, often associated with emotion, unpredictability, and depth. While his theories remain controversial and are sometimes taken too far, a key detail cannot be ignored. When men reject or suppress this internal dimension, it does not vanish. It manifests as projection, seen in others, often in women. I used to perceive that as abstract symbolism until behavioral threat research offered an alternative approach. Abstract symbolism. Experiments conducted in 2008 by neuroscientists at New York University showed that when participants were exposed to ambiguous threats, their amygdala activated more strongly than when threats were clear. Uncertainty triggers a greater level of vigilance than when facing situations that are clearly defined. The mind prefers a known enemy to one that is undefined. These are the conditions under which power systems operate. Ambiguity undermines authority. When economic conditions fluctuate or social norms shift, leaders perceive unpredictability as an existential threat. Their instinctive response is to simplify. Authoritarian rhetoric makes its appeal clearly. Across the regimes of the 20th century, the narrative was the same. Political speeches repeatedly personified instability as moral decay, decadence, and corruption, linked to feminization. As historians analyzing propaganda have demonstrated, the national weakness in early 20th century Europe was framed as softness, luxury, and indulgence. The remedy was virility, discipline, and an embrace of hardness. This pattern repeats as it is psychologically reliable. According to social psychologists studying support for authoritarian leaders in 2016, those with a higher intolerance of ambiguity were more likely to prefer strong leadership styles. The source of attraction was not ideology alone, but a feeling of relief, a promise of chaos subdued. In this context, the metaphor of woman can function as ground, a symbolic landscape which is seen as the reservoir of disorder. By feminizing chaos, disciplining it becomes a demonstration of strength. Doing so allows the leader to dramatize his control over the unpredictable. These traits are not exclusive to states. Similar narratives emerge within corporations during times of crisis. After the market collapse of 2008, some chief executives described market volatility as irrational and hysterical. The history of the word hysteria traces back to the Greek word for uterus, suggesting an unconscious feminization of instability. Aggressive corporate restructuring and decisive cuts formed the solution and were framed and implemented with firm, masculine leadership at the helm. Those working within these firms felt the human cost. Sudden layoffs were justified as restoring order, and middle managers have described being told to man up and execute the prescribed reductions without any hesitation. Uncertainty and vulnerability had no place within management or external communications. The business of economics was externalized, and an internal response ensued based on domination. Theory gives way to mechanics in the aforementioned case. When a group senses uncertainty regarding their future, behavioral studies on threat perception have shown that those same groups tend to increase in boundary reinforcement. One 2014 experiment conducted at the University of Kent that primed participants with discussion of a market collapse illustrated this point well and demonstrated a stronger sense of social rigidity, as well as advocating harsher punishments for perceived social deviancy. Order becomes a moral imperative. This instinct was not invented by Machiavelli, rather it was observed and codified by him. The entity of Fortuna was condensed the unpredictable, but into a more easily conquerable form by gendering the deity. The prince wasn't merely required to endure chaos, but to attack. The metaphor transforms passive waiting directly into active domination. I did not expect the depth of penetration this framework holds within everyday experience. Rarely do company leaders admit their uncertainty when sensing a loss of control, such as a decline in profits, a shift in the internal culture of disruption to systems, departments deemed inefficient, external market conditions, or disloyal teams might become designated as scapegoats with a face. The employees are acutely aware of this externalization. These externalized figures become the terrain upon which control is reasserted via a set of new metrics, displays of decisiveness, and stricter, more rigid oversight. While the symbolic structure of the system appears stable from the external perspective, underlying volatility may not resolve. The enduring nature of the aforementioned behavior is unsettling. Across different centuries and various cultures, the authority completes the same choreography repeatedly. Gender the instability, identify the threat, and promise to eradicate it. Rather than a product of literature, the metaphor is neurological, congruent with the way the brain may interpret and tackle ambiguity in times of crisis by designating an identity to the issue and resolving it. The following paradox is still present. The image of control is heavily dependent on domination by externalizing chaos in order to maintain said vision. A symbolic other needs to exist in order to maintain this coherence, such as a woman. Instability does not get resolved, just renamed, and the pretense of domination may be unable to stand against the uncertainty that is unresolved with existing means. A blueprint may be the best way to describe the metaphor when the requirement of symbolic terrain is high. By now, the trend might be discernible. Niccolò Machiavelli, in The Prince, sought to build a logical methodology in order to provide psychological defense against the instability rulers tend to endure rather than generate a misogynistic worldview. A structure is almost entirely produced that provides this defense against instability's effects. Power can encounter a period of chaos, such as through a shifting alliance, betrayals, or outside forces imposing on Florence, and the resulting emotional effect that destabilizes rulers can cause a similar effect in the business world, in the form of economic changes and technological interruptions. Instability is eased through the act of personification as a character whom is described as erratic, over-emotional, and seductive. This manages the complexities of instability through association with a manageable entity. Once externalized, control is made to seem like an aggressive form of protection, through framing as a necessity by the ruler instead of as aggressive behavior. The University of Amsterdam managed to quantify speech patterns used by multiple democracy leaders in the Western world through an analysis of the strength of the rhetoric of those leaders used in coordination with the discussion of certain market conditions, and found an inverse relationship between references to firm power and mentions of empathy, a quantifiable shift that happened over a period of instability around 2019. Communication in corporations provides a similar viewpoint of this action. Memorandums that were released within some institutions in 2008 often mentioned the words discipline and control, which led some employees to express that a hostile feeling was made against uncertainty in the pursuit of safety that was pushed through layoffs that were viewed as necessary to reinstate some sense of control. At this point in the analysis, moral judgment begins to form, and it might seem simple to state that Machiavelli might have had misogynistic viewpoint, making it difficult to analyze structurally the reasoning and justifications of the views shown. Research shows people will want strong power present even through cruel and unusual circumstances to act as an uncertainty management tool, which supports the previous claim. Experiments from the journal social psychological and personality science around dominant rule were viewed more positively when framed around the presence of volatility, which resulted in a decrease for the need and desire of participatory decision-making, which made people desire reliability instead of a true sense of fairness. This viewpoint reshapes the previous viewpoints to a new analytical direction. Domination is framed to be masculine in a world wherein chaos is feminine. Reassurance can be provided through this framing, creating a sense of security with a person of capability who often receives support for the ability shown in response. Many executive meetings often show this dynamic during the process of crisis management, and managers that are set at higher levels of hierarchy tend to mention eliminating the emotional presence during times where fiscal projections collapse to a certain degree, resulting in high tensions during discussions with a decrease in the presence of flexibility in certain situations. The true views expressed by Machiavelli become secondary at this stage, because authority defends its status due to the views that are being perpetuated, which includes the redirection of responsibility during periods of volatility. If feministic code is set to be representative of weakness, the rejection of that code might make power define itself on that very code. The feeling of certainty would then be represented by the masculine persona that represents stability. People can be affected in multiple ways. If a decisive ruler is present during periods of instability, they may be more likely to feel secured. When uncertainty rises, those same rulers tend to control decision-making more, forcing a reduction of freedom to those under them. The central thought of analysis needs to evolve. Framing the question around Machiavelli's views, shown historically on woman, becomes short-sighted for the grand scheme, while instead, attempting to ask why language used still maintains similar trends of associating hysteria with feminine figures centuries later, and framing discipline with terms that promote strength. With repetition, the metaphor continues to be present, which creates reasons to keep it present. Fear can turn into a justification from this action, while transforming domination as a mandatory action. A possible final point might appear. If there needs to a feministic view to dominate chaos, a requirement for stability might be that volatility persists in order to preserve stability. This may make final judgment on Machiavelli to shift outside of this analysis. Stability is the key for defining the subduing of the uncertainty shown, by designating the other as the figure to take charge, when that is the figure they seek to control due to pre-established biases.